Welcome to ICN Sunday Morning. I'm Vernon Loeb, Executive Editor. This morning, we're going to talk about wetlands. I know, this was a big week in climate. The Trump administration announced its walkback of the endangerment finding, and the Trump Energy Department put out a scientific paper minimizing the risk of climate change. But in ICN fashion, we're going to zig while everybody else zags. And we're going to talk about another disaster that took place. And I'm talking about the Wetlands International Conference in Zimbabwe, the Wetlands COP that took place there. A fight immediately broke out at this conference of 172 nations over the protection of wetlands in the Ukraine. Russia then walked away from the conference. China backed Russia. Canada backed Ukraine. It was a mess. And the US throughout all this was a no-show. There were two chairs sitting there empty that said US on the back of them until a representative of the Trump administration showed up in the last moment and demanded that none of the documents from this wetlands conference should make any reference to DEI, climate change, the UN's growth goals, or degrowth. Joining me this morning to talk about the Wetlands COP is our own Katie Surma, who was there. Katie, thanks so much for joining me from Zimbabwe.
My pleasure.
Yeah, so first tell us why wetlands are important to climate change, why we should care about wetlands, why the world should care about wetlands.
Yeah, well, first, they are an enormous carbon sink. So they store loads of carbon dioxide. They also help mitigate against the impacts of climate change, acting like giant sponges or barriers when there's flood surges or floods or storm surges. But they provide tons of other benefits for humans, whether it's food. They're known as Earth's kidneys because they filter water, giving us clean water. They provide habitat to loads of species. But despite all of this, they're often overlooked. They're disappearing faster than Earth's forests, and they also are more effective at storing carbon than forests. So if you want to solve climate change, if you want to protect species from going extinct, you have to focus on wetlands.
Yeah. So getting back to the conference that you covered on wetlands.
Yeah.
So the conference begins, an international fight immediately breaks out over Ukraine's wetlands and the protection thereof. And Russia walks out, and China ultimately sides with Russia. And Canada then says, we're with Ukraine. There's nothing political about safeguarding Ukraine's wetlands. But watching all of this, it's sort of hard not to see the COP that you covered as a sort of metaphor for the challenges of international governance, is it not?
Yeah. I think that's right. And I think there's a few things there, like, the Ukraine issue in particular, people were really split over how to think about it. On the one hand, you had folks saying we need to keep our heads down and anything that's controversial, we shouldn't get involved in. That's a slippery slope people were saying to me because you had, the US didn't show up, and then the second to last day of the conference, it flew someone in, and they insisted that the word climate change shouldn't appear anywhere. And so if you start carving out space saying we can't touch anything political, you get to, race to the bottom really quickly because scientists are telling the convention climate change is destroying, it's degrading wetlands, and wetlands are a solution to climate change. So how do you not talk about it? So that was sort of the Ukraine specific issue. And those things pop up in environmental governance because the environment touches everything. But then you had this wider debate that is, it comes up all the time, whether it's a climate convention or biodiversity, which is you have people on all sides criticizing it. On the right, Trump and has called these things woke or sort of a tool of the left, whether it's the Paris Agreement or the United Nations itself. And you have people on the left saying, these are toothless. There's no police force to enforce them. So why do we do it? Um, but I think you have to ask the counterfactual to that, which is, okay, if we don't have these things, if we don't have places where governments can get together and talk about problems, then where are we? And specifically with the Wetlands Convention, people were pointing out that, you know, this isn't perfect, but since we've had this in place, more than 2,500 protected wetland sites have been named, because of the convention, and that's progress. Um, so these debates are good to have, but I yeah, I'll just say these debates are good to have, but I guess I suppose for me, I think these institutions are a good thing.
Yeah, no, I take your point. Some global governance is certainly better than none. And I think we have more than just some. It is often an effective mechanism, which
Yeah.
brings me to my next question. The absence of the US here, 172 countries, or maybe 171 countries get together to talk about wetlands, except the United States. And then when we do come, we come bearing demands like no mention of climate change, no mention of DEI, as if the rest of the world even knows what we're talking about when we talk about DEI. In an
Yeah.
international forum, how did that no show and then that last minute attendance, how did that play in among people from all over the rest of the world?
Yeah. Well, some people relieved that the Trump administration didn't send someone, and though that group was relieved because they thought the US would be obstructionist. Um, then, just more largely, many people were upset. You have the one country in the world that for the longest time has been a leader on environmental issues, not even bother to come. Uh, and that's after pulling out of the Paris Agreement twice. And people told me repeatedly that they can't understand the United States. They think that what it's doing is against its own interest. Um, and I think that the fact that the conference was in Zimbabwe on the African continent added a whole other layer to it. Zimbabweans, other people from other nations in Africa and other parts of the global South um, told me that they're being hit really hard by the various cuts that Trump has made. I mean, I heard repeatedly that people are dying, from not getting medicine. And then in the environmental space, I had conservationists say, we are bracing ourselves. And we're talking programs that protect, rhinos and lions here on the continent, that funding for those that come from the US government's going away. So what does that look like? Um, yeah, people are also well aware that the US is, the biggest contributor to climate change. And the fact that it's pooling assistance for programs that help communities that are really vulnerable in places like on the African continent prepare for those shocks. I mean, that doesn't sit well.
Yeah. And I guess you were something of a lightning rod there. You mentioned to me that you thought you might have been the only American reporter there.
Yeah. 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 I was quite shocked, and I should say I don't know for sure that I was the only American, but I'm pretty sure. Uh, and I mean, I guess, it was just surprising given how important wetlands are. Um, and I mean, I guess this is also a plug for Inside Climate News, and I know I'm talking about my own employer here, but like I just think it's really great that we could fill that gap, that someone was there, and our story has gotten a little bit of traction on the US side. Uh, but also, I've been watching the Africa space a little bit more closely, and it just doesn't get a lot of U.S. news coverage, and it really should. So, um, with the story we wrote, I tried to hear from as many delegates from the African continent as possible, and their messages are really important. I mean, one of the key ones we talked about in the story was that from Sierra Leone as an example, they need resources to help protect their environment. The will is there, but they don't even have, for instance, the geospatial technology to inventory what their wetlands resources are. Um, so those stories, those voices are really important to highlight. I think so. So I'm glad. Thank you for sending me.
Well, thank you for doing such a great job. Um, so let's now talk about China with the
Sure.
Trump administration essentially a no-show. Um, Tell us about the presence of China at these global talks on wetlands.
Yeah, it was quite interesting. We see the US pull back and China leaned in. It's at 90 people, but a 90-person delegation. And when you walk into the conference, the first thing you see in the middle is China's tent, and it's like 10 times the size of any other tent. And they're touting all of the work they're doing on wetlands conservation, mangroves, for instance, and adapting their cities to, so-called like wetland cities. And so they're clearly trying to stake out a position as a leader in the environmental space. Um, but it was notable that even though there was a lot of showy stuff that they had going on, they were resolute in opposing a budget increase for the Wetlands Convention, which scientists said we desperately need this. So it's a bit of a complex thing.
Yeah. So as readers of Inside Climate News may know, we've started a series this year on China's Belt and Road Initiative that you and Nick Kuznets and Georgina Gustin are writing. And part of your reporting, I think, on this trip is actually geared toward that series. Um, Again, with the Trump administration off the stage, it's China now exercising all this soft power around the world, or I should say, quote unquote, soft power around the world through Belt and Road. How is China as an environmental steward faring around the planet? What is your reporting telling you about Belt and Road and its impact on climate and the environment?
Yeah, yeah. Well, that is the key question we're trying to examine, and we've seen positive things so far, and not so positive things. On the positive side, when it comes to climate, I mean, they are exporting and investing in renewable energy abroad more than anyone. And its government is really seized on this. It's tried to rebrand the Belt and Road as green. Um, but our reporting is showing too that there's another side to that investment initiative. It's enormously destructive to local communities and to the environment. I mean, just for one, to manufacture those solar panels and electric vehicles, you need metals and minerals, and you have to mine to get those. And some of our forthcoming stories will be looking at some of those mining impacts. But I think your question about how the soft power is playing is really interesting because whatever you make of China, it's mounting a serious challenge to, you know, this idea of democracy, these ideas of democracy and human rights. You have the US that was the standard bearer of those ideas, pulling back from them. And China, which is a one-party state, is telling other countries, follow our model. You don't need free and fair elections for legitimacy, just create economic growth for your people. And a lot of governments around the world are really receptive to that. Um, but the questions I think we're trying to, grapple with is what does environmental protection look like when you don't have a free press, for instance, to report on, environmental issues, and what does environmental protection look like when local communities have no rights and no way to enforce them. So I think we're going to have some interesting stories coming out later this year.
Yeah, yeah. I'm so thrilled our readers were able to hear from you. You have such an interesting background. You were a attorney for 10 years before you decided to become an investigative journalist and a climate journalist. And I think you really bring kind of a depth of perspective and knowledge to everything you write about. So it's just great having you over there in Africa at the Wetlands Conference, and now working on the Belt and Road project that you're doing. So let's end on a hopeful note, right? Solutions journalism. Tell me something you learned at the Wetlands Conference that makes you hopeful that nations working together can counter the climate crisis and bring about stability and respect of nature across the planet.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think for me, there was widespread support for a resolution that Uganda led on, and it was about seeking recognition of the contributions of indigenous people and local communities. And that said two things to me. One, there's consensus on a lot of issues, maybe consensus on more things than there's division on. But then the substance of that indigenous peoples and local communities are kind of getting their due in these big environmental spaces. These are people that have vast knowledge of ecosystems. They can teach us things not just about those ecosystems, but about their perspectives. They don't look at nature as a resource to extract or to monetize. They don't look at nature as something separate from them. They live in these ecosystems, and they know that they are part of the ecosystem, that if you destroy a river or you fill in a wetland, you're just going to be harming yourself. And that is the kind of transformational thinking that has the potential to change our economic systems, our legal systems, and seeing it being widely recognized and kind of finding its way into the center of these conversations, that's really encouraging.
Yeah. You're going to have to come back soon and talk to me about rights of nature, which is another really big thrust of your reporting. Thanks so much for being here this morning, Katie.
Yeah, thank you, Vernon.
Yeah, and thanks to all of you for watching, for reading our work, and for supporting our work at Inside Climate News.